Hello makers, welcome to Share Stitchery. I'm Catherine Harris, and this is your spot for all things sewing and DIY. And today I wanted to share with you how to construct a corset. Let's get to it. So this pattern for this corset was designed by Red Threaded, and it is the Victorian corset. So you can find their patterns on Etsy, and I really like how historically accurate a lot of those patterns are. That being said, I did make some alterations to this pattern. So before I get into the actual sew along, I thought I would chat a little bit about the pattern itself. So Red Threaded doesn't offer any nested sizes. You actually have to purchase a specific size. So based on their size chart, I purchased a size that fit with me. That being said, it was vastly too big. I even reduced the corset by 2 inches, and it is still really, really big. So I would suggest sizing down, and I went by my bust measurement. Now that being said, I tend to have to do about 9 times out of 10 a full bust adjustment, so my bust to waist ratio is a little bit larger, so I think that has a lot to do with it. So ideally, the back of your corset, you want to have about a 2-inch gap once you've tightened it up and laced it up, because as you're wearing your corset and you're going through the day, it's going to stretch and you are going to want to be able to tighten it up a little bit more. So this corset, after it has been done, when I tighten it up, I still have like tons of room that I could tighten it at my waist, but it's already butted up against one another. Now I did do some fitting on this, which is why I took out those 2 inches. That being said, that wasn't enough. So what I would have loved to see is maybe some nesting sizes on that pattern, because now I would have to go in and purchase the smaller size and have the larger size for the bust, grade down to the smaller size at my waist, and then out to the larger size at my hips. That being said, I am not going to do that. I am just going to adjust those pattern pieces by really kind of carving out the waist for the next time that I make this. But it is a bit of a bother. So in terms of sizing wise, I do feel that this pattern does fit quite large for the sizing, especially if you want to use it in any sort of cinching capacity where you're actually doing some waist reduction there. You're definitely going to want to size down significantly. So those measurements I almost feel are based on those finished garment measurements as opposed to body measurements. So it would have been clear to have that, because if I would have saw that that's the finished garment measurement, then I would know to size down maybe 2 sizes in order to get that correct size for the corset. All things aside, the rest of it seemed to go together quite well. That being said, I did have a pattern piece, and I do believe it was probably the center front and the center side front pieces that there was like a big piece of overlap that just like didn't make any sense to why it was there. And I have watched other videos of individuals and read blogs, and they, on this pattern, even in different sizes, larger sizes, smaller sizes than what I made, are exactly what I have found to be the case. So I think that there may be an error on that drafting, particularly with those 2 pattern pieces. Now, in terms of the instructions, they are pretty sparse. So unless you've ever created any sort of corset before, you might have a bit of trouble trying to put it together. And they're not necessarily as intuitive as it would be, especially if you're working with indie patterns in like sewing garments. It's going to be a bit of a surprise to you reading some of those things. Now, I have made tons of corsets and costumery in my past, so I wanted to quickly go through some of the things that I did for this. Now bear in mind, when I'm creating this, I am creating this to be more of a costumey style corset as opposed to a waist cincher, just because when I had originally done it up and cut out my pattern pieces, there was basically no room left for me to recut in new fabric. I was using up scraps I had. You'll also notice, if you look really closely, there is a seam on one of the front panels because I ran out of fabric. Now, if I was looking at doing something that was going to be a little bit more professional, there's a couple more steps that I would follow, but these are pretty much the same steps that I would do for the vast majority of corsets and will really get you the look that you're looking for. So without further ado, let's get to that actual tutorial. The muslin toile or mock-up. So for this, you're going to cut 2 pieces of all of the pattern pieces, and I am using this dissolvable thread. So it is water soluble. I just got mine off of Amazon. I will link it down below here. And it is fantastic because you can use all of your corset parts. You pop it in some warm water and it just dissolves. I'm using regular thread in my bobbin, and then I am going to thread the dissolvable thread in my spool here for my sewing machine, just the way you would any normal thread. I also use this in a lot of my bra making. So that is the facing piece. We don't need that because we're not going to actually be creating the facing. And I am just marking where we turn to attach the busk. Because this is a mock-up, I am not going to put the busk in. Now, if this is something that you are going to be wanting to wear every day for waist training, I would suggest putting in the busk in your mock-up so you really get a good idea of how that feels. I am just doing a rough fitting here. And so I am just marking it out along with my seam allowances and where I want them to line up here. And so I am just going to pin that in place and stitch that together right where the busk would be. And I am just putting in my pins horizontally, and then I'm going to stitch that in. So I've stitched all of the pieces together, including the back pieces, and I've marked where the grommets go. So I am just poking some holes in the back. I'm not actually putting the grommets in because this is a mock-up. You could if you wanted to. Now you can put in the boning channels that you would typically be using, especially if it's going to be waist cinching. For this instance, I don't really want any cinching. I just want the look of the corset. So I'm just using this nylon boning and I just zigzag it on with the dissolvable thread. And then I can really get a chance at seeing what it looks like. And I've just laced it up with some lace that I found around. Now here is the mock-up on, and so you can see just from the back that it is way too big. So my husband laced it up and he laced it up so tight it gave a bunch of puckering in there. I want this higher on my bust line here because it doesn't fully cover it. So I am just going up here. And I think I want to go up about 2 inches, 1.5 to 2 inches up. So I'm just folding down what the seam allowance would be. And I am just getting a good idea of how high up I want it to be. And then I'm just writing this down so that I don't forget. You could put it on a separate piece of paper, but I like to write actually on the muslin here. And so I want my arc to come up, and then because this is going to be a costume one, I actually want it to come down with more of a sweetheart neckline in the front. So you can see I am just drawing on that sweetheart neckline, just exaggerating it a bit more by taking the cups up and making the plunge go a little bit deeper. Now, another thing you want to pay attention to is the point at the bottom, how it goes over your hips as well as under your arms, because you want that to fit just right. So I noticed that it was too tight in the back. So what I am going to do is I'm going to take off about 2 inches on either side of the back, and I'm just doing that on the back lacing pieces. And then I'm going to make my pattern adjustments here on the pattern. So I am marking it here, and I had adjusted it 2 inches up and then down, and I'm using my French curve just to get a nice little curve. Then I'm going to take the other side of the pattern piece and I'm going to lay it right sides together, folding where that busk line meets, and then making sure that both sides are the same. So we do have these big wonky curve bits. If you're making a double lined corset, where you have that coutil lining on the inside, you actually don't have to worry at all about those two little pieces that jet out on the side. Those are basically the built-in facings if you weren't to line them and you were to just have that single layer. I always like to do a double layer with my corsets, so I probably could have just sliced those off here, but I sliced those off in a later step. So next I am going to stitch up this second mock-up because it is important for us to know how these adjustments changed the overall fit. Now, I'm especially doing this because I made adjustments in the bust. And so when I am doing that, I am thinking there is a good probability that there are going to be some adjustments. So I increased it, but then you can see up at the top, I need to round that cup a bit. So what I'm doing is I'm just pinching that excess right here. So just creating a little wedge, and I like to choose the top peak of the bust, and I'm just pinning down. So I stitched or drew where that wedge is, and then I'm just going to find on my pattern piece approximately where that wedge is going, and it's going to about this point here. So I'm just going to mark a little dot and highlight that with an X, and then next I'm going to measure how big my wedge is that I'm going to take out, and mine is just over that 2-inch mark, so 2 1/8 of an inch. And then I'm going to draw out my wedge using my ruler here. So I'm just drawing out the wedge. And then what we're going to do, because we are going to be removing volume here, I am going to slice down to that point, and then I'm going to overlap it because we want to remove that volume. If we were adding volume, we would spread it out. Just need to go a little bit closer to the edge so I don't get that little pucker there. And then I'm going to match up that line here. Then I'm going to get out my trusty tape, and I'm going to tape that pattern piece in place. And so this reduces the volume of the cup at the top so that it fits it a lot better. Now, ideally, when you're done making these adjustments, you would make up another toile. That being said, I didn't because I was wanting to save on a little bit of time, but you know, you live, you learn. Next, you want to walk your pattern down and make sure all of the notches match up, especially those waist notches. They're very important. I'm just going to round this out just slightly here. And then I am marking what I have done for my adjustments. So the fact that I have gone up and I have adjusted the cup. Step 1 is the pattern pieces. So these are the actual pattern pieces here. So I have cut out 2 of everything, and I have lined them with a fusible woven interfacing. Do not use the non-fusible. And then you can use coutil or any other stable woven garment like a twill, one that has absolutely no stretch to it. Now there is one exception in terms of the pattern pieces. On the back lacing detail here, I have actually cut out 4 pieces, so a right and a left of my main fabric and a right and a left of the other one, and I have interfaced both the coutil as well as the regular fabric. So step 2, the right front busk. So it comes with a facing piece. You don't need that if you are lining it like I am doing today. And so we have our 2 pieces, and see that little pointy piece that could get sliced right off. I just kept it in because I kept it in my pattern. And then we're going here and we want to mark along the line where the busk placement stitching line is. And we're just going to draw that on. And then you're going to get your busk out, and you're going to get the one with the little loops on here, and you're going to position it so that you have enough space along the top and the bottom so that you can still attach the top binding pieces. So you want at least a ½ inch from the top and the bottom of that metal piece to attach your binding. Then I'm just drawing in where those hoops are. And this is going to be my stitching guide. So we are going to pin this in place so that nothing moves about. And this would be the same if you were using the facing piece. You do the same steps, you just have a smaller piece. You're going to stitch from the top, start and stop, and you're going to skip over where each of those humps are, because of course we don't want stitching there, because that is where our busk is going to go through. So be very certain to backstitch at the top and the bottom. and be very precise in your stitching. With corsetry and bra making, it's very important to be very precise because even an 1/8 of an inch can make all the difference in this. And then just make sure we continue to go down, back stitching at either one, cutting our threads and starting and stopping along each of the areas where the busk faceting is going to go through. And just coming up in here. And there we have it, it's all stitched. So the next thing I'm doing here, I'm actually trimming off that little piece that we do not need. And then what we can do is we're going to go to our pressing station, and the first thing you're going to do is press this open. And this just helps to set that seam so that it is easier to fold. And then working from the coutil side here, I am just going to be rolling it in, and you want to make sure that you see just the edge right along the edge. You don't want any showing on either side. You want it to be completely even. And then you want to push the busk in through those holes, and you're going to push it as far as you can to the front and use pins going down vertically so that they hold that busk in place. Okay, and so we are just going to pin it and make sure it's very secure because you do not want to break any needles. And so the more pins you use to really hold that in place, the better. It also gives you a nice stitching line, and you can really feel through all of the layers where that busk is. You're going to start on one side and go up and go down, encasing it in. So I am using an industrial zipper foot here, which is a very small one, so it gives less room than a traditional zipper foot. It's also used for cording and maybe called a cording foot at your local sewing shop. You will also notice I am grabbing my safety glasses because I don't want to break any needles and blind myself. So then you come to the end, you pivot, and then you stitch off the end and make sure you backstitch at both the start and the end of this. And then you can see that I was supposed to have included the waist stay ribbon in here. That being said, let's just attach it to the exterior. So I'm folding over the end, and apologies with the black on black, I should have chosen a different color of ribbon. But you're going to find the notches on the waist, and you are going to pin it in place, and pin it in place along the seam you had just stitched, because this is where we are going to attach that ribbon. So I'm just pinning it on the right side, and I'm going to stitch that down, and you can see that the ribbon is now attached. And I've just got a couple extra threads I'm just going to clip out here, and you really can't see that I've done a second row of stitching on there as well. Now for step 3, the side and back seams. So in this instance, we are going to match those waist seams, and we are working on just a single layer. So I am going to fold out the lining layer away so that it is not in my work surface, and I am going to pin matching up the bottoms as well as those notch marks. Bear in mind that I do believe this was one of the seams that didn't fit. Now in my adjustments, I changed that in the pattern, but just so you know. And then we are going to do the exact same thing with right sides together on the lining piece, matching up those waist pieces. So we're going to go out there and we start pinning at that notch point, which is the waist notch. And then we are just going to continue to follow those curves. And it's very similar to stitching a princess seamed dress. Not very much different than doing that, which is actually quite nice because it's fairly simple. So now we have the 2 curves. Do not clip those curves. We are going to press them open, but you do not want to clip them because you want to ensure that you have that security of those stitches and that seam allowance. Not to mention, we are going to use these seam allowances as our casings. Now you could also use external casings, but if you have a double lined corset, you don't actually have to put any casings on unless you wanted it to be a design detail, because you can use the 2 layers sandwiched together as that casing. So right here, I am just matching up those seams and I am lining them up along here. Now, if you're going to put casings on top, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to stitch in the ditch right along that line. If you are going to put 2 pieces of boning side by side, you will stitch in the line and then you'll create the 2 channels on either side. If you're just going to put 1 piece of boning along the front here on this seam, then you don't stitch in the middle, pin down the middle, because you want to ensure that you are getting right exactly on the fold of that seam on both sides, but you are going to stitch on either side wide enough to allow your boning channel to go through. So depending on what width of boning you have will determine how wide you make that seam here. And once that's all pinned in place, you are going to stitch your boning channels. So before you do that, make sure you pull your ribbon to the back side and match up those waist notches and then pin it in place, because you want to catch that waist stay ribbon right along there. Okay, so now that I have stitched that in place, we are going to do the next side seam. So in this one, we have 2 notches and we're going to match those up. And once again, working on a single layer, this one is the right side, and we are just going to pin this together. So just working up and down here, we are going to pin the corset in place and stitch that at the machine. So it should look like this. And then we are once again going to do our lining layer. And once we have that lining layer pinned in place, we will match up those notches, making sure everything is fitting exactly as it should. And do be very precise on your seam allowances. So this particular pattern has wider seam allowances. I do believe 5/8 of an inch. And that is because if you're making a single layer, you could fold all of the seam allowances to one side and use that as the boning channel. So you don't actually have to purchase separate boning channels. That being said, I never like that method as much. I prefer to purchase those boning channels or use the lined method like I do here, so everything looks nice and seamless. And that being said, there is something to be said about having the contrasting boning channels on the exterior of the corset for a really nice design detail. So that is something that you could consider as well. And so just match up along those seams, making sure we have everything all matched perfectly and lined up so that nothing has shifted. And once again, you want to make sure that you are attaching that ribbon piece exactly where it needs to go on the waistline. And it's important that it is on your waistline because that's an area of big tension in a corset. So in that instance, you want to make sure you're catching it and it is nice and flat. And then you're just going to stitch those boning channels in just like so. And so we are going to continue with the rest of the back pieces here. So I'm going to go a little bit faster on this one. So we are just going to attach it, matching up those 2 notches for both the exterior and the coutil side. And then we're going to attach those boning pieces. So step 4 is the left front busk. So as you can see, this is where I pieced my pattern together. On the finished product, you don't really notice in person as much. So for this, because it has a facing built in, we actually don't necessarily need that. I am just looking at where they are marking where our stitching line is for that busk. So I am going in here and I am just pinning this in place, and I had built in the seam allowance in my pattern piece when I made the adjustments to where my stitching line is, so I could just follow the edge of that seam allowance. Once again, we are going to press this open, and then we are going to fold it right sides out, wrong sides together, so that you have a nice external piece. So the next part here, we are going to look at where our stitching line is going to be. So I am just measuring how far away that stitching line is, and I am finding that measurement on the ruler, and then I am going to transfer that. And that is typically about 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch, just depending on the pattern as well as your preference, because this is the underlap on the busk side. So we just want to stitch that in place. And once that is stitched in place, we are going to take the other busk and we are going to find out exactly where those holes are. So I've actually placed it inside, so they're actually clasped, and I can feel those little posts on the top. So I am just clipping the center front right here, and then just feeling where that post is, and I am marking that with my chalk. And so you just want to go in, and because we aren't going to be putting the the holes through the edges, I'm just overlapping it so that that line comes right up to the edge here, so that when I am feeling, I can mark it accurately on that stitching line here. And so I'm just marking all the way down. I'm taking the other piece of my busk out for the clasp side from the hook, and then I am just going underneath, and I am using an awl to start. Now, if you have a larger awl, it will work. So this is too small of an awl, it is not going to work. So I am actually going to punch my holes with this leather punch. So I got this at Tandy's Leather, and I use it for all of my leather craft work. If you want to see a video on some of my leather craft, I would be happy to share that with you. I'm not sure if I've shared anything yet, but I do really like working with leather. And so I'm just going in here and I am punching it out, and I just matched the tip to the size of the post, and you want it to be slightly smaller. And it's also very important that it is not bigger than that post, because you'll get some fraying. It's not going to lie nicely. So just try to get it so that it is just slightly smaller than the actual post itself. Okay, and so I'm just going to put the tool away here, and then I'm going to use some fray stop. And so I love this because it helps the fabric not to fray. You do want to check it to make sure that it doesn't leave a permanent mark on certain fabrics, particularly like twills. You are going to see what looks like a wet mark permanently on that fabric, so do a test spot on that. Then just put your busk in place, and then we are going to do a quick check here. I'm just going to do it up and make sure everything is lining up exactly as I wanted. So my top is lined up and my bottom. So the next thing we're going to do is very similar to what we did on the hook side of the busk, is we are just going to place our pins vertically going down here, just holding that metal in place because we are going to top stitch this. So you want to pull that fabric nice and taut, and then we are going to stitch along one side and down the other. So that is all nice and secure. Now we're going to add the ribbon the exact same way that we added it the last time. You could have added it in the seam allowance, but because I had started off by putting it on like this, I'm going to continue that way. Next, I'm going to find my waist notch here, and you will notice in my finished version, mine are slightly off center on my right and left side for whatever reason. So maybe grab the other side of the piece and just make sure that that waist ribbon is in the correct spot here. Now for step 5, the left side and back seams. So this is pretty much a repeat of the other side, where we're matching up those two notches on either side, and we're working with just the one layer of fabric. So starting with the external fabric, pinning it, stitching it, and then going in and pinning and stitching the tuile lining layer with right sides together here. So once we have that all stitched up here, we're going to press it out and then just go in and stitch those two areas to create that channeling, making sure we're catching the ribbon. And we're going to repeat for the next side panel here, going on either side, and this is what it looks like so far. And then we've got another panel that we are going to add onto here, and once we have that stitched with the channeling in place and we have our two sides here, we can put them together, and then you can see I've slightly got it off center here, but it's not too terribly bad. It's still around that waist area. And next we are going to go on to step 6, which is the back lacing panels. So with these panels, I have marked the areas on here, but you don't necessarily need to do that till a later step. And then I am just going to take all of the two layers and I'm going to fold them with wrong sides together. So that lining layer you are never going to see with this lacing layer. So in essence, you've actually got 4 layers plus 4 layers of interfacing on there. So it's like 8 layers. This is an area that you want to make sure has a ton of strength so it doesn't pucker in the back. So I'm just drawing on here. These are the channels. We want a boning channel on either side of the lacing with enough seam allowance to be able to actually insert it in. So the first thing I'm going to do is with right sides together, just working on the front layer here. I am going to pin this in place. So this has a pretty drastic curve on either side, and I am just going to move that lining out of the way, and then I am going to pin it. And you want to match the raw edges. Obviously, we want that folded edge pointing out to the exterior on the finished lacing panel here. And I am just going to pin this in place, and there is a ton of layers here. You may want to don a denim needle when working with this. We're just going to stitch that down so you can see it is stitched, and I am going to grade the seam allowances. So I'm grading the seam allowances down just because you have a ton of layers. So that is, 4 layers on that lacing piece, and I'm just leaving the external piece just open, and I'm using pinking shears on that as well. And then I'm going to give it a nice good press to press that open after I had reduced some of those layers. And we want to pay careful attention to that front. Next, we are going to take the coutil layer and we are going to pin it going just over that seam we just sewn. Now, you can't see the seam very well because I'm using black thread and it kind of matches the striping on the fabric, but I am covering it by about 1/8 of an inch. So you do want a little bit of an overlap here. And so on this, I have glass head pins, so I'm giving it a good press to kind of really keep things in place. And then we are going to add the ribbon tucked right under here and pin that in place, and then we are going to stitch it. So I have stitched it in place just on the exterior here. And now you can add in any additional boning channels that you want that aren't in the side seams. And especially if you're making a larger size, it's a good idea to add extra ones. Now for the grommets. Now I'm going to be using my leather punch tool, and I have selected a hole that is just slightly smaller than the size of the opening in the grommet. And then we are just going to get out our template here. And this is why I like to do the markings here, because I can make sure that they have a nice even spacing. And then we are just going to go down and attach these grommets. We want to make sure that they're centered between those 2 boning channel lines, as well as evenly spaced. I'm just going down here and I am lining it up, and I actually like to fold it in half, and then I can really mark going across here where those grommets are going to go. And then we are going to go over and actually punch out those holes. So I'm just using my leather mallet here, and I am going to go in the center of that channel, and I am going to give it a couple good taps to create a nice hole through all of those layers. What is that, 8 layers, including all of the interfacing? A decent amount. And you may need to kind of come in with scissors and trim them. Next step is going to be adding the grommets. So a grommet has 2 pieces. So you have the external piece, which is typically your color. In this case, I chose black to go with the rest of the corset, and then you have an underside. So on the right side, you are going to place that colored piece, and you're going to pop it through and just poke it through all of those layers. I'm just going to flip this over and make sure it's gone through nicely. And then on the back piece, you have one with ridges, and then you have a more smooth side. The more smooth side goes out to the edge with the ridges facing inwards. Now you can use a tool to tap that down by hand, but goodness knows if I have a machine, I am going to use my grommet press. So I just pop it in, and you want to make sure that the exterior is on the bottom, and then you're just going to press it down nicely and just really set that grommet in. And it is all done. And it actually is quite easy setting these grommets in. I actually find it quite fun. And your corset is really starting to look like a corset now. Now on to step 8, the boning. This is a very important part. So you have that Ridgeline boning, and I also wanted to show you some boning channels here. I just have white on hand. So you could use that either on the inside or the exterior. If you are wanting to have any sort of waist cinching, I would highly recommend steel boning. So there's 2 types of steel boning. So you're going to have the flat steel, and those are what you want on the back pieces that are attached on either side of the lacing, as well as the center front piece. These wired boning channels that are more flexible, so flexible wire, those can go on the inside. The Ridgeline, it bends. You don't want that for any sort of waist cinching. That's more kind of like fast costumey. So you are going to come in here with your boning, and just in between those channels, you're just going to push it in. You're going to do that for all of the sides. So next I have my boning in, and I am going to make sure it is all out of the way. I'm going to push it up and out of the way, and I am going to stitch 1/4 of an inch on the top and the bottom just to secure it all in place. Next, I like to fasten up my busk with right sides together, and then go in and just make sure everything is exactly the same. So we want to make sure that, the bust rise and all those adjustments that we made are exactly the same on both sides, because you are really going to notice it when you do it up. And then we are just going to go to step 9 for the corset binding. So you could use pre-made double fold bias binding. And I only had this pink on hand, but it would just go over just like so. But I wanted to have fabric that matched. Now you want to cut that on the cross grain or the bias, because you want it to have stretch. If it doesn't have stretch, it is going to pucker and it is not going to go over those curves very nicely. You're going to cut 4 strips that are longer than the length of area that you're going in. I am just pushing all of my boning down so that I do not break a needle. And then I am going to fold over the end. So if you see here, I am just folding that over, and I fold it over about 1/2 inch. And then I am matching up with right sides together along the front of the corset. And I am just using my clips to hold it in place. Now I'm just flipping my clips around here because we are actually going to be stitching from the wrong side. So those stitching lines that we gave, that was about 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 inch on the other side, depending on how wide you want that top binding to be. That is what we are going to do. I'm just trimming the extra so that I have a 1/2 inch overlap that is going on the other side here. Next, I am marking exactly where that metal busk is coming in, because that is going to be a tricky spot. I'm going to do the same for the bottom piece as well as both the top and bottom on the other side. So it should look just like this. So the next thing we're going to do is we are going to fold this into the inside. So we're folding it in half and then down again, tucking in those corners. And I like to start with each corner to make sure each corner is nice and flat. And the one that comes down in a peak is a little bit more fiddly to get folded neatly. Just takes a bit of fan dangling. And then you're going to fold the binding in half and then down so that you have no raw edges, and use a clip to pin that in place. And you are pinning it towards the wrong side of your corset. And you're just going to keep going down, going through all of the curves and just making sure that everything lines up nicely. I'm going to do the exact same thing to the bottom of the corset as well. Fairly easy to kind of get this going, and it's a nice way to really finish the bottom. You could use a contrasting color, which would look really beautiful as well. Okay, so once we have that all clipped in place, you can either stitch with your machine across here, being very careful not to hit your boning channels, or if you want a bit more of a couture technique, and my personal favorite, we are going to do the ladder stitch to attach this on invisibly. So I like to go in and along the ends, I like to actually stitch them together using that ladder stitch. So a ladder stitch is where you stitch on one side and take a couple threads and then go on the other side, and your traveling down the fabric is actually done within the folds of the fabric. So if you want a more detailed tutorial on the ladder stitch, I do have a video that I made on that, and I will link it down below for you. But essentially, it is one of the most common stitches in dressmaking that you are going to use. So becoming familiar with it is a good idea. So close up again, you pick up a couple threads throughout the fold on the binding, and then a couple threads up on the fold down on the corset fabric, not going through to the front. And you are going to go down exactly in the same spot that you come out of, so that you're creating like rings of a ladder, hence the name ladder stitch. Next is step 10, modifying the lacing so you can lace it up yourself. So unless you have someone that gets you dressed, you're going to want to be able to do up the corset yourself on your own. So what a hack to do that is you're actually going to add a set of grommets in between the middle set. So you want to find where that waist area is. So I just counted my grommets to find where my waist is, because of course those notches are all hidden with my stitches. Or you could look at the ribbon on the inside. Then we're going to go in and we're just going to add in a grommet right here. And so I'm just putting that in, and we're going to add it on both sides. So now we have kind of like 3 that are close together. In an ideal world, you want at least 2 that are close together. So now for step 11, lacing the corset. So to do this, I have this ribbon. I am just using a full pack of ribbon. In hindsight, I probably should have cut it down for you because it might be slightly confusing with how long these ribbons are. So I apologize on that end. So I'm just going to use some Scotch tape here, and I'm just creating a little X formation with the ribbon, and you want the center of the ribbon just taped to whatever surface. And I'm just separating the left and right sides of the ribbon. Now you always want to come in from the bottom or the back of the corset to the top. And so I'm taking one side and I'm just crossing it. And then I'm going to take the other side and I'm going to cross it, also coming in from the back of the corset here. And then I'm just straightening the ribbon to make sure nothing is twisted as I go. And then I'm going to take the other side, and so you go from left to right, and on the right side you go from right to left, just crisscrossing like you would with shoelaces. And so I am just going to pull that through once more, and you can really see how that lacing is coming together now. And then I am going to go through a little bit faster here to kind of show you how we are going about doing this. Now you want to go up to where we had installed those grommets that are close together. Okay, so just continue going back and forth on either side until you get to that point. And so we have reached that point here. And then I'm just going to show the ends here. I'm just kind of getting out a couple of the tangles on either side. So with that, we are going to cross it over, but we're going to skip one, once again, going in from the back. So we have skipped one grommet, but we have crossed over to the other side. And we are going to go up, and this is the key to allowing you to lace it yourself. You are going to take this next one and you're going to go from the top and pull it through. So you're going up that one that you skipped on the same side, and you're going to leave a little bunny ear on there. And I like to leave my bunny ear about as long as my corset is wide on that one side here. So you're going to skip one, go in through it, and then coming up from the top here, we are going to go in, and then we are just going to pull that ribbon until we have a bunny ear that's about as long as our corset is wide. And then we are going to take that next one and we are going to continue to crisscross, coming in at the bottom and going from side to side, just like we did for the top. So you're going to continue the rest of this exactly as you did at the start. The key is just getting to those areas where you have those grommets close together, skipping one, coming up, and then going up from the top to create that bunny ear loop, and then just crisscrossing them as you continue to go down the bottom. It's as easy as that. And even if you have an existing corset that doesn't have those grommets close together, you could just add a set of grommets in between there so that you can create these bunny loops to be able to adjust your corset yourself. So next thing I am going to do is I'm going to spread this apart just slightly. So just remove that tape and just wiggle it so it is nice and open here. And then I am going to trim down my threads here, my ribbon, just a little bit. I'm just going to cut this, and then we are going to tie the bottom of this lacing. Now, because we have a front busk, we don't need to have necessarily as much lacing because it doesn't need to go over our head, which makes it so much easier. Love having a front busk. And then you just pull on the sides and you can really lace this up yourself. And this is what it will look like when it is all done. I am so excited to put this on, and you can either tie it in a bow or hide those laces in behind. And now for the reveal. Now I hope you enjoyed that tutorial and it really did help you in your corset making journey. If you have made a corset before, do let me know in the comments down below what your favorite pattern is, or do you just draft it yourself based on your measurements? That was originally what I was planning on doing, but I wanted to save a little bit of time. Until next time, makers, let's get our sewspiration on.